The petroleum industry is a crucial driver of Nigeria's economy, contributing substantially to the country's GDP. Under the leadership of President Muhammadu Buhari, there have been efforts to reform and restructure the industry to increase efficiency and accountability. One of the major achievements during President Buhari's administration was the passage of the Petroleum Industry Act 2021 after several years of delay. The aim was to restructure the industry to make it more streamlined and transparent, which should increase investors' confidence and lead to increased production and revenue. At the Nigeria International Energy Summit held recently, President Buhari shared his lofty achievements of his administration as the Minister of Petroleum Resources. This included the rebranding of NNPC into NNPCL and the launch of gas initiatives to improve growth rates, addressing the Niger Delta crisis and several other initiatives that he brought on board. Now, despite these efforts, the industry faced significant challenges, which includes the drop in oil prices, oil thefts and insurgent attacks on oil facilities, low oil production output, inability to revive and reactivate Nigeria's oil refineries, high fuel importation volume, incessant fuel scarcity, and fuel subsidy, which all had negative impact on the industry. On the show, we want to evaluate Nigeria's crude oil industry under President Muhammadu Buhari to see how he performed. And this morning, Bolan Olojede, an Executive Director, DMA Advisory and Management Services, is joining me to look at this. Thank you so much, Bolan, for joining us.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. My designation changed though, but that's
okay.
fine.
Okay, no problem. So let's look at the performance of Nigeria's oil GDP. Now, in 2015, it was said to be minus 5.45. That was when Buhari came into power. And it rose a bit to about 4.69 in 2017, but then dropped to minus 8.89 in 2020, and a further drop to minus 19.22 in the year 2020. That was just last year. Now, how would you rate, looking at these statistics, how would you rate the industry with the president being the Minister for Petroleum Resources?
Okay, I think it's an error on the part of the president, not just this president. OBJ was Minister for Petroleum as well. I think maybe one other person as Minister. We have to stop this idea of merging those two offices. Let the president do the president's work, and let's have a proper Minister for Petroleum who understands the industry, an industry person who understands policy issues, understands the problems, and is able to advise the president. For a situation in which the same person is the president as well as the Minister for Petroleum, even if the person doesn't know much about petroleum, it's an anomaly. And if we're going to develop that industry properly and remove a bit of the political externalities that are exerting pressure on it, we need to separate those two offices. Yes.
But when you look at the past administration, there were other administrations that had separate individuals as minister of this particular industry, and we still did not see any significant increase or growth, as it were. We still had issues with shortness in the aspect of contracts being awarded and revenue being remitted into government coffers. So is the problem actually with the person in question that's meant to occupy the position, or the fact that there should be some bit of accountability and maybe transparency and some sort of having processes being done appropriately and due diligence when it comes to contract awarding and contracts to be signed and oil blocks to be awarded and every other activity that has to do with oil production, exports and remittance of these revenues from export sales?
We're never ever going to be able to get to those places you're talking about if we don't, first of all, separate those two offices. It is not possible for someone who doesn't understand an industry and what is going on there to run efficiently. I'll give you a very good example. The current president, for example, did not understand how the subsidy regime works when he was coming in as a president. As a matter of fact, you can go back to some of his interviews in those days. He literally was saying there was nothing like subsidy. But someone who has said there was nothing like subsidy had continually had to deal with issues of subsidy throughout the 8 years. And is even leaving the place having not addressed the subsidy issue. So someone who is going to be the Minister of Petroleum must at least, first of all, have an understanding of the problem and the workings of the industry. Then he now has to be able to deal with the political side of things. For example, Kachiku had a thorough understanding of how the industry works. And we could see the effort he tried to make in the direction of subsidy. As a matter of fact, subsidy was removed at some point in time in 2016. Just that we went back to that subsidy regime as the petroleum prices increased in the market. That was what happened to us. So the fundamental is that there must, first of all, let's have a separation of those duties, and then we can begin to address issues of accountability. The current NNPC GMD did a little bit when it comes to issues of transparency. For the first time, we started to see audited account of NNPC coming the year after the financial year. So it is expected now that we will see 2022 audited account. In the current year, there was a time when for 6-7 years, there were no audited account of NNPCs. Nobody even knew how they were performing. So we also have been able to see, it was because there was an account in the first instance that we were able to see that, oh, in one particular year, NNPC actually made profit. Though the profit it made was not from operations, it was an extraordinary profit, but he made profit. So when you start to have account, you can begin to query the content of the account, and it's all part of the accountability. So some other elements of accountability that will come into that space will come by virtue of implementation of the PIA, as the case were. By the time you start to see a separation between the regulator and an operator, what we had pre-PIB was that NNPC is a regulator, is an operator, he has oil field, is everywhere. How do you operate and regulate yourself? So one thing that PIB has set us to do in that particular space is to say, look, these are the regulators. Now, here is an operator, and this operator is going to operate like any other private sector-led operator. We must agree that we are not quite there, even as far as NNPC Limited is concerned, but the foundation for that has been set to us.
All right. Bella, we'll go back to the issue of the PIA Act and the administrative processes it was meant to provide. But then let's quickly go back to the issue of subsidy that you mentioned. This particular administration expended 11.7 trillion naira to pay as subsidy for PMS, as it were. But then this same administration also oversaw issues with fuel scarcity and adulterated fuel being sold to consumers, as the case may be. And this administration also said that it would remove subsidy before the expiration of its tenure on May 29, but then rescinded that decision and suspended it indefinitely. Now, could this issue have been avoided? And why did it make that U-turn on the decision it made on suspending the subsidy? And if that was wise also to have done that?
Okay. First, subsidy has two very important components, and it's important to address it from those two components. One is economic. So when the government is saying, I spent over 6 trillion naira subsidizing petrol, that is economic. If I remove the subsidy, that means I can release for myself 6.5 trillion naira, which I can put in transportation, I can put in power, or whatever you want to put it. Purely economic. The other side is political. Political, you could see the elements of that political part when you run through the fact that the military was not able to deal with this matter. Subsidy started to creep into our system right from the 70s. So the military was not able to do it. When we got to the current republic, OBJ had wanted to do it, he couldn't do it. Yaradua couldn't do it. Jonathan couldn't do it. The current president said, oh, we will. I think there were expectations after the president had probably understood that there is indeed subsidy. and people like Kachiku were pushing for it to be removed. There was hope that I would remove it, especially when PIB became a law, become an act of parliament. But you see, the political side of things did not make it possible for him to do it. By the time we passed PIB, the president was already preparing for the next election. When you are preparing for the next election and you start to talk about removal of fuel subsidy, and you hear things like from Labour, things like we will create an environment that will make NSAS protest a child's play. There is no politician that wants that kind of a situation to happen under his watch. And when you look across the world and you see where removal of fuel subsidy has not been looked at from the political effect as well, it ended up in serious crisis. Kazakhstan will be the last one that I will remember. It led to violence, there was massive protest, and this is how it plays out in countries that are not sensitive enough to the political side of fuel subsidy removal. So to do it and do it effectively, the president must address those two sides of the issue. There is the economy, we are being pushed to the brink, we might be pushed over if we don't do something, but there is the political, which requires that we have the political will to deal with it. The political will has several dimensions. That the political will to be able to deal with the people who are beneficiary of the current regime. They are beneficiary. So, and we've seen how that played out under Jonathan, where even the mother of the minister was kidnapped for issues of subsidy. So there is the people who are current beneficiaries. There are also, you also have to deal with the citizens' perspective and how it will affect them and the economy. So it's a very complex place, but it is doable and it must be done. There has to be a comprehensive plan. It is not a snap your finger kind of policy. Of course, that should be obvious from the fact that no government has been able to handle it. So it is not a routine decision. Whoever is going to do it has to have a robust plan for engagement, for palliatives that make sense, not palliative of collected 100 million and share it to the poor. No, those are not the kind of palliative that we're talking about. But we have to walk through a plan and have a robust engagement so that the ordinary citizen, when he asks himself, what is in it for me? He can have a conviction that it is actually in my interest to remove this fuel subsidy.
Okay, now let's go back to the issue of complexity and, of course, the PIA 2021 Act that was signed by this current administration. Some people have said that it was too complex. That was why it was hard for previous administrations and this current administration to actually go ahead and sign it into law until it eventually did. So is that the reason why there was a delay in signing the law, number one? And two, did it actually address the issue of the legal framework and the administrative processes for the oil and gas sector? That is two. Then three, did it also address the issue of the structure and the separation of the offices and the operations that is meant to be undertaken under the oil and gas industry?
Okay, the delay in passing the bill rides on the back of that political side of things. It is a deeply political issue, and there were various contesting interests from the north to the south to the resource owners and also to Abuja, which is the center where the Commonwealth is shared out to all the other states. So the competing interests were overwhelming. That was one of the reasons. It delayed, I think, about 13 years before we could pass that bill into law. Then we also need to realize that we are never going to have it perfect before we can pass it. So there are still a little bit of issues here and there, even in the final version that was passed. If you remember, after it was passed, there were still some protests, some new proposal for amendment. Oh, the communities, this percentage allocated to us as community is not good enough. All those things were still there. But what is important is that we have been able to move forward. We suffered a great deal for those 13 years of delay because unless there is a legal framework and the institutional framework, the investment that we desire into that space will not happen. So major investment, we denied ourselves major investment in that industry because there was no legal framework to lean upon. So we created an uncertain environment for prospective investors over those years. Nobody brought money. And we are still suffering from the impact of the poor investment over the long period for which we did not pass the PI.
Okay, now let's look at the gas side of the industry. This administration launched the National Gas Transportation Network Code and the Nigerian Gas Flare Commercialization Program. And these two initiatives were meant to tackle the issue of gas flaring and declaration of a decade of gas till 2030. And of course, it was meant to also increase gas demand to about 16.6% in annual rates. So what's your evaluation or what's your rating of these two initiatives as gas exploration and the production of gas for exportation for export rather, and for domestic consumption?
The gas flaring initiative that you spoke about is actually gas flaring commercialization. You see, one of the problems with gas flaring over the years was the reality that it was easier, and it was easier for them to flare it than to want to monetize it. If the commercials do not add up, unless there is a sanction that is so huge such that it drops the impact of flaring it, then operators will not respond. There is no operator, no private operator that doesn't want to make money. So the only reason the problem persisted is that the commercials did not add up. Now that we have a specific initiative.
Hello, Balan. Balan, you may need to unmute your device.
Issues around why operators were not willing to make money. It doesn't make a commercial sense that you have an operator, a private sector operator who doesn't want to make money. So once we are able to get the commercials right, operators will encourage, and we will begin to see better. We'll begin to see changes in that space. But this will all depend on implementation. It is not enough to launch an initiative. It's not enough to put terms of reference. If we don't have a consensuous and diligent, disciplined execution of the terms of reference, much will not happen.
All right.
This will also have implications even for there's an initiative in gas. I think it's the Decade of Gas Initiative, something like that. And the Decade of Gas Initiative is a very, very important initiative launched under this administration as well. Those are the kind of initiative that will have ensured, let's say we did this 10 years ago, maybe we'll have ensured that while Russia and Ukraine were having problems, or are having problems, and there is gas problem in the entire Europe and other parts of the world, then a country like Nigeria will have been in a position to, while we are carrying the brunt on one side, there is a problem with wheat production, with fertilizer, all sort of brunt that we are carrying. We will have been able to say, oh, there's also a benefit for us in this, because we are a gas nation, more of a gas nation than an oil nation.
All right.
That opportunity and that problem created an opportunity for us to make money. For us today, it wasn't. We didn't make any money by virtue of that. Not even from oil, not to talk of from gas.
Okay, so
with an initiative like the Decade of Gas agenda, Nigeria should be preparing itself to be able to take steps in the future.
Okay, so before I let you go, Balan, without having to cast aspersion on the Buhari administration, this has been on the lips of so many Nigerians. And it has to do with the fact that some economists have echoed the sentiments that the Buhari administration could not revive or resuscitate, as it were, 4 Nigerian refineries. But the business mogul, Aliko Dangote, built one in 6 years. So the question is it that it wasn't a priority of the Buhari administration to see how it can revitalize these refineries, or it's just as a result of sabotage by some certain individuals who have interests and are directly benefiting from the non-functionality of these refineries? Quickly.
Okay, I don't think government has run any enterprise successfully. And refinery cannot be an exception. Government cannot even print money profitably, not to talk of run a refinery. Well, now the contracts have been awarded and we are all looking forward, maybe this time around the contract will actually lead to functional public refineries, hopefully. But I have seen this since the days of Abacha, with the turnaround maintenance on this same side of refineries, and 25, 26 years after, they still have not produced. But let's be hopeful that this time around, maybe they will become productive. However, I still have my concern that even when they become productive, will they be competitive? Will those refineries be as efficient as the Dangote refinery, which is a private initiative? Or will it be a case of when the private practitioner, when the private sector came into telecom, and vis-a-vis what happened to Niger? For several 30, 40 years, I can't remember that Niger was existing. It did not even have up to 1 million subscribers for like 40, 30 years. Meanwhile, today, we are probably 150 million lines in this same Nigeria. So will Dangote and public refineries mirror what we saw in telecom? It is left to be seen. I do not believe that government can run those businesses properly, so that even if we end up waking up these refineries, we must consider privatizing them or asking the private sector to run them for us. It is government doesn't do well with business. That is the reality.
Oh, okay, that's quite interesting. But then maybe the focus might not be for these Nigerian-owned refineries to compete with private refineries, or this particular private refinery that we're talking about, as it were. Or maybe the focus is to get it optimal and support or supplement the efforts that this refinery will be coming on board in terms of refining fuel, as it were, and ensuring that it is domesticated and not having to spend trillions of naira to import them from other countries, as it were. But then let's just leave it that way and quickly consider one particular aspect that some people have considered as maybe a reason, a tenable reason why the current administration did not perform optimally in the issue of the oil and gas industry and its operations. Now, this particular administration witnessed oil instability, reduction in oil price in the global stage that actually dropped about 70%, as it were. There were issues of insurgency, oil theft, pipeline vandalism, and all other negative activities, as it were, that impacted the production of oil, that reduced the production of oil and made it impossible for Nigeria to meet its quota with what OPEC Plus demanded. So do you think that these are actually overwhelming concerns that made it impossible for the Buhari administration to meet up with its obligations and targets?
Well, definitely those are some of the problems. And a lot of these problems are still there. Look at what oil theft has done to us, for example. And the lack of investment over the years as well. This country had, at some point, I think the last time was November 2005, produced 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. We went from 2.5 million in 2005, and we started to go down up until we got to 931,000. That was sometimes in September last year. Well, of course, after September last year, we started to inch up. We went above the 1 million barrel. But in April, we still went back to 99,000 barrels per day in April. So some of these problems are still there. We still need to be able to cut the necessary level of investment, which we did not have while we were waiting for PIB to become a law. We also still need to address those insecurity-related issues. Insecurity-related issues is part of what is driving the cost of production of oil in Nigeria to be above most of the global averages that we know of. I remember that sometimes in 2020, there was a report that said exploration production cost in Nigeria about $48. So at $48, we were more costly than Angola. We were more costly than Uganda. Not to now talk of places like Saudi Arabia where it was less than $10, or many parts of the world where it was between $20 and $30. So these are some of the causes. Of course, there is also issues of corruption-related issue, oil theft, and other problems in that space. Even the period it takes, the contracting period in Nigeria is longer than it ought to be. So some of those issues are still there. The current administration also faced 2 cycles of oil crash. In 2015 into 16, there was a very bad crash in oil price. And then in 2020, the same thing. In fact, in 2020, it was so bad that oil price became literally zero. People were willing to give it to you free of charge so that you can just empty the tank and go away with it. So those things might be part of it. But for me, one of the problems with this administration and that probably limited possible achievement included the fact that the president was also the oil minister, and he did not have the right level of knowledge about what was going on there. So who was he listening to when it comes to advice? Things as fundamental as how many liters of fuel do we consume in Nigeria? We don't know it as we speak.
Well, that's a very big challenge to have someone be at the helm of affairs, but then not have the adequate knowledge or statistics by which to judge the operations of an industry that he heads. That's a major challenge when you talk about accountability and having the details right. Now, one of the things you mentioned while you were responding is the issue of corruption, and that was one of the campaign mantra of the current administration, to tackle the issue of corruption, not only in the oil and gas industry, but in all endeavor of the Nigerian economy. But then we just want to focus on this particular industry. How would you say that the current administration fared in dealing with the issue of corruption?
Not much was achieved, not much. But the corruption in oil and gas, I'm sure if the president should be aware of 20% of it, he will literally pass out. The industry remained as corrupt as it was. For as long as there are corruption incentives like subsidy being paid upon a consumption that was not properly established, how do you pay subsidy if on a consumption when you are not even so sure of what number is that consumption you are dealing with? I remember Minister of State for Petroleum saying, doubting the figure of consumption that we have on the table. So if at that level there is a doubt about the consumption, but upon that same consumption we have been paying subsidy, it should be glaring that not much has been achieved in terms of curbing corruption in the oil and gas. We had a situation of bad fuel being imported into this country, and I'm asking myself, who made that slip? Was anybody punished for it? I don't know. For as long as there is impunity in the system and we cannot uphold the rules, corruption will continue. It is still there and not much has been achieved. The ball, maybe with PIB now, the incoming government will have to leverage on the provisions of the law and on the foundation being set by PIB, approach this matter with a better level of discipline, and we probably can do better with corruption in that space and in Nigeria generally.
All right, that is a beautiful way to end, I must say. Thank you so much, Bola Olojede, for joining us. We are hoping that the incoming administration will be able to look at the lapses and look at the weaknesses and faults in this current administration and see how it can better tackle them and bring about some sort of transformative and positive growth to the oil and gas industry, because that is a major money spinner for the country. We appreciate your presence, Bola.
Thanks for having me.